There are all kinds of ways out there to get help, from sponsorship to therapy to
12-step program, accountability group.
Right? To mentoring, to coaching, all kinds of ways to get help for yourself or to get help for your family. And today we talk to
a Christian counselor.
Yes, and his podcast is called Ask a Christian Counselor. So one of the things that's really cool is he does a question and answer session, plus he does Skype counseling, which is amazing, especially if you live in a small town.
Have you done Skype counseling?
I have not with him, but I have done some.
Really?
But if you live in a small town, what can be some of the issues of finding a counselor?
Gossip. With small town, there can be a lot of gossip, and it could be brought into question if people see you entering and exit in the office. And then, of course, just with small comes less variety.
That's right. So today we interview Tress Adamas. He is the director and founder of Arizona Christian Counseling, and it is just amazing what he has to say about codependency. Stick with us.
Real life for real families. Hurts, habits, and hang-ups happen in every family.
Jerry and I are here with tools to help you trust God, clean house, and tell the truth to ramp up the joy in your family.
You have what it takes.
It's time to become sober on purpose for His purpose. So, hey, and welcome to the Sober on Purpose podcast. We have the great pleasure of being with Tress Adamas, and he is a board-certified pastoral counselor and director of Arizona Christian Counseling in Phoenix, Arizona. Tress received his Master's of Divinity from Wesley Bible Seminary and a Bachelor of Arts from Asbury University. He is on the board of the Pacific region of the American Association of Pastoral Counselors and a member of the American Association of Christian Counselors. He has previously taught on the faculty of the College of Theology at Grand Canyon University. And so we thought we would bring on someone who has professional experience in talking about codependency.
Welcome, Tress. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we really appreciate it. And how I found Tress was I was looking for things for codependency and to hear more about that. And Tress has a podcast called Ask a Christian Counselor. You want to tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. So I've had the podcast for almost 7 years. I actually started it when I started counseling, just as like a resource for my clients. And it just slowly built up over time, and it has grown with the practice over the years. So,
and it's really, folks, you need to check it out. He also does do they reach you by email? You do a question and answer, which I thought was really good. Do they reach you by email? Do you want to give that too on how they can reach you?
Just the website is askachristiancounselor.net. There's a contact form on there. Some people ask for questions. Some people ask for prayer. We have people that can pray with them. You can also just tweet me, Tress Adamas, on Twitter, just TRESADAMES. So I answer some questions that way. So we either answer questions on the podcast or sometimes through a blog. So.
And then what I really liked, and there's a lot of stuff on addiction. That Sober Guy, there's a lot of things on addiction, but you specialize in codependency. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you came to that and what you do?
Yeah, that's one of my top specialties. I have a few others, but I think it was just mainly because as a Christian pastoral counselor, I just had a lot of people that were coming that felt a lot of shame and guilt about standing up for themselves. They thought in order to be a good Christian, they had to let people walk all over them, that they could never say no. So it's just kind of a common issue. I think that happens for a lot of believers. Even people that are not necessarily like pushovers, they struggle with being able to say no because they want to do the loving thing. So it's kind of an issue that comes up in the church as a whole. So.
And in the podcast, and you'll have to go listen to a podcast, how did you tease that out biblically? And kind of what would Jesus say about people walking all over you?
Yeah, so I usually just start with the preconceived notion that a lot of believers have, that they have to be a pushover, that they have to say yes to everybody. And then we look at it biblically. And, one thing I emphasize is our goal is not to be Christ to other people, because that's usually kind of what happens when people are codependent. They're trying to rescue somebody else. They're trying to do things for another that only the other person can do. They're taking responsibility that isn't theirs. So first of all, our goal is not to be Christ, like literally Christ to them as a savior. Like we are to be a conduit of God's grace and to be, the hands and feet of Christ as the church. But at the same time, we are not that person's savior. So we have to recognize when something is beyond our control and beyond our ability to really make any type of change.
Do you have any measuring sticks that you use to help the person on an individual level determine that?
It depends on the situation, because boundaries, which is probably something you guys talk about just
all the time.
Boundaries are flexible things. So it depends on your level of trust with the person. When we meet somebody brand new, our boundaries are pretty far out. I think of it more like if you have kids, like who are you going to trust? Are you going to trust a stranger right off the bat? No, not at all. Your boundaries are going to be further out for that person than somebody that you've known for a long time, that's part of the family. And so it's the same thing with boundaries themselves and codependency, is we have to recognize, okay, who has earned the right to be close to us? I use the analogy of the temple in the Old Testament. You had different levels that certain people could reach. So a lot of Bibles, and maybe you can flip yours open sometime, whoever's listening, and you might have a diagram of the temple in the Old Testament. And what it shows is just different parts of the temple and how certain people were allowed to enter certain parts than others. There was a court only for that only Jews could go into. There was another area that only men could go into. There was another area that only priests could go into. And finally, only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, and that was once a year. And so really our heart is the same way. Not everybody has access to us on an individual personal level. Our spouse is probably the one who gets the closest, but beyond that, even only God does. And then beyond that, we have our closer friends, we have family, we have acquaintances. And so boundaries are going to be relative to how much that person has earned your trust. So if that person has broken your trust, there needs to be stronger boundaries there. So.
Hey, if we could just backpedal just a little bit. When we did our podcast, which focused directly on codependency, we did our best to define it, but maybe you could also define it and hopefully add some depth to our past podcast.
About boundaries. Sure. Define boundaries.
Well, or codependency.
Both.
Both, please.
Okay, sure. So codependency is kind of one of those pop psychology words that's been thrown around that everybody uses, but at the same time, it can become very slippery because when one person uses it, it doesn't mean the same thing. The way I explain it is just kind of the origin. So the word codependency came out of AA, which has been around for a long time, because they found that it wasn't just the addict that was addicted to the substance. It was also typically the spouse of the addict as well that was not addicted or dependent on the substance, but dependent in the whole process. They were kind of caught up in everything. They were taking responsibility for the other person. They absorbed a lot of the anxiety that the addict did not want to take care of. So they became codependent in the process of that person being dependent on the substance. So that's what we mean by codependent. They're not dependent on the substance, but in a sense, they're codependent on the behavior. So codependency is really where it's not a mental illness. A lot of people probably get this idea that it is. Because I tell that to some people if they're struggling with this. It's like, it's not a mental illness. This is a dysfunctional relationship dynamic that can change. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to kind of recognize that this is something that can change with effort and with something what's known as boundaries. So codependency is when somebody is taking on responsibility for somebody else's behavior when it isn't their form or function to do that in a healthy way. And so it's almost like they kind of take on a parenting role that is not healthy. They kind of mother or father the other person. There are relationships where there's no substance involved at all that can be codependent. Mm-hmm. And so, maybe somebody's in a relationship with somebody who's very narcissistic or very controlling. And it may not even be physically abusive. It may just be emotionally abusive. But they're codependent on the other person. They're trying to take responsibility that isn't there. They're doing way too much. They're saying yes when they should be saying no. And so boundaries are one of the first things that we teach people who come to counseling for codependency is, what are some of the areas, and one of the best ways to recognize where there need to be boundaries is what are the areas in your relationship with the other person where you feel a lot of resentment. Because where you feel resentment, there is usually a need for a boundary.
How do I determine if it is something that I need a therapist for? Maybe I need a 12-step group. Maybe I need to see my pastor. How do I determine that it has gotten to the point, or I don't even want to say that. Where would therapy step in and say, this is something we can help you with?
Sure. So support is needed no matter what. So it could just be a very close friend. It could be a pastor. It could be a support group. You need people to help you build that backbone, which takes some time. Now, when it gets into things like self-esteem or even trauma, that's where counseling can help. So maybe somebody learned how to be codependent because of something traumatic that had happened. Maybe they grew up in a dysfunctional family, so there's stuff in the past that they haven't resolved. Or they just need to build up their own confidence and their own self-esteem. That's something that can be worked on in counseling. So.
And I really like when he's talking about that if you're having a lot of resentment about it, then that's probably someplace that you need to set a boundary, because you're not,
yes.
I would assume at that point, you're not doing self-care. You've given
definitely not, no.
everything away. And we did a lot on codependency. We did one around, it's not just with, as you said, it's not just with somebody who's addicted, but you can have codependent parents.
Oh yeah.
And do you see folks who are, we see it in our lives in small ways of we're giving everything to this child and not holding everything back. What would you say to codependent parents? How do you draw that line?
Yeah. So, and this happens when, people come into counseling and they bring their kids, especially I work with a lot of teenagers. So sometimes this comes up, and some parents want to kind of protect their kids from having to deal with more pain or more harm than they want them to, which is fine. I mean, nobody wants to see their child suffer. We understand that. But at the same time, there's a certain level of healthy pain in life that helps us grow. For example, there might be parents that might pull their kids immediately out of a sport if they're not very good. Well, I mean, that's how you get better, is you recognize that your level of skill is not the same as other students, but if you still have a desire to play that sport, it takes time. So rather than just like having the child avoid consequences, we want them to just encounter healthy pain in a good way that helps them grow. So usually codependent parents are usually trying to protect their kids from any type of consequences, even their own consequences. They're afraid of punishing them. When in reality, and not that it has to be like punitive or anything like that, but they just kind of let their kids off the hook all the time. So what did they learn? They learned that, I can get away with whatever I want, and they wonder why the behavior is so dysfunctional. It's because you haven't allowed any type of healthy boundaries or consequences in the process of raising your children. So sometimes when that happens, if we have people come into the office, we work on discipline and just what consequences are. Consequences don't even always have to be negative. They can be positive as well. You can stir your kids toward positive behavior by rewarding and reinforcing positive behavior. So,
Tress, in your experience, would you say that, not that you can speak for anybody else, but that pretty much everybody has to struggle with codependency at some level?
It depends. It depends. So, I mean, I would probably say there's a majority of us that probably have to learn a lot of these lessons. There are some people that they've just learned how to deal with life by bullying other people through just avoiding things, whether or not, again, a substance is involved. But definitely I do notice people who struggle with addiction, codependency is often underneath a lot of the behavior. So it is something that they do have to learn. Not just how, their partner might be codependent, but how they also might be codependent. So sometimes it's like trading one addiction for another. Somebody might stop drinking, but then they become super involved in the recovery process. They go to every single church event. They take on way too many responsibilities. So they become almost a workaholic instead of an alcoholic. So sometimes the codependency has to be worked on almost like in a second phase of their recovery. So.
Oh, it's good, because you kind of answered my second question with that. Would you say that it was healthy for a Christian to be dependent on God as that part of their life?
Yeah, we kind of struggle with how you look at you look at that, and if God wants all of us, I don't see God as codependent. He's not codependent on us. Are we becoming codependent on him? And how do you?
Would it be scripturally sound to say that as Christians we should be dependent on God? I guess that goes without saying. But at what level does it become unhealthy?
Yeah, where does it cross the line?
Yeah. So dependency is not bad. We're all dependent. We all came into this world being dependent on our parents. We didn't have any access to food or water or shelter when we were first born. So we grow up being dependent. The whole goal is helping children become interdependent so that there's a healthy level of independence and dependence. Because even as adults, we still depend on one another. We still need to have relationships. So the goal is not to be codependent, but to be interdependent, where you're still an individual, but you're connected to other people in healthy ways. And even our relationship with God is like that as well. He doesn't want us to be completely dependent on him. He still wants us to grow in responsibility and as individuals as we connect with other people. And so, a lot of times this comes up when people will ask, especially new believers, is like, what do I pray about? Do I just pray about all my problems and then just hope that God will take them all away? Well, that's usually not how it works. Usually we pray in order to get wisdom, in order to get strength, so that we can go out and make the right choices. That's usually how God works. He wants to see us actually being the change in the world in order to reach out and to affect others in a positive way.
It reminds me of the old joke where there's a family in the flood. Have you heard this one, where the water level's coming up and the fireman comes by and then they say, no, it's okay. We've got Jesus. We're going to be all right. And then it gets up halfway to the second story and the boat comes by and says, the family says, no, it's okay. God's going to take care of us. And then they're on the roof and the helicopter comes by and sure enough, they end up in heaven and they question, their creator, and they say, hey, how come you didn't help us? And he says, what are you talking about? I sent the firemen and the boat and the helicopter.
All those things.
Exactly.
Well, and you've kind of touched on something that we disagree about is, does God want you to pray? And this is Jerry's example. Does God want you to pray about whether you're going to wear the green shirt or the red shirt? I mean, what kind of minutia do you want to get into with that? And I think that's kind of a theological discussion that is not really worth entertaining. What I do want to entertain is interdependence. We talked about that a little bit. What would an interdependent relationship? Because we focus on talking about not so healthy relationships, and I know you work with people who are moving towards healthy relationship. What does an interdependent family look like?
Yeah, so this brings up a whole kind of specific form of therapy called family systems theory. And typically, dysfunctional families are either too independent, like people are just not connected, or they're overly dependent. They're overly emotionally involved with one another. So anxiety or stress in a family can spread like a virus if people are not independent in a healthy way, if they're not interdependent. The term in family therapy is known as self-differentiation. So when somebody is not self-differentiated, they are poorly differentiated. And so as a result, they are dependent on other people within the family for everything. And there's nothing wrong with being connected with family members, but when we take on responsibilities of other people, it can cause a lot of problems. And so this is kind of alluding to your questions about dysfunctional families. But typically the most emotionally weak person in a family controls everybody else. And so to be self-differentiated means that you are grounded in your relationship with God. You know who you are, but at the same time, you're connected in healthy ways with other people without taking responsibility for them, without allowing your heart to be completely absorbed by what they're feeling and what they're doing. So
we're raising a teenager right now. And we're working with what he is really triggering us on. He's really triggering me on some areas that are still not as healthy as they could be. And sure. I'm watching him act what I think is age appropriately. He's testing things. He's testing boundaries. He's trying to figure out how far this goes and how far that goes. What does a parent possibly a codependent parent, need to be thinking about as they're looking at that child who is acting age appropriately? You know, what's kind of age appropriately in that era with the teen and the parent who's trying to step away and not be codependent?
Yeah, and if you need to bill for this, that's fine.
So, the whole point of, I mean, all of parenting can be compared to pretty much potty training. Like, the whole point is to get the child to do whatever it is on their own, and being able to step away and trust that the child almost depends on themselves to get the job done. So, especially in adolescence, even 100, 200 years ago, it was common for 13-year-olds to be treated as adults. You know, they had that drive within themselves to be independent, and so society gave them opportunities to do that. Now it's different. You know, kids are considered minors until they're 18. So they kind of go through a little bit of a struggle within themselves to be independent, but at the same time, they're not. They don't have any legal right or even ability, financially to be independent. And so you can use that desire for independence in your favor to encourage them to strive for things. You know, one of the easiest examples of this is, a lot of kids want to start driving at 16. And so you kind of set up the parenting plan in a way where they can earn maybe points using kind of like a tally system, to where they can earn points for things like gas or extra time that they can spend with their friends. So you're using positive consequences. You're using their own desire for independence in your favor, but ultimately helps them at the same way, because this is how everything works in the real world. You know, when you get a job, you want a raise, you're going to have to work hard, and so you get rewarded for working hard, and so you're kind of preparing them for that dynamic for the future. So their desire to be independent is a good thing, but if they're acting out, they're rebelling, it might be because there's maybe too much control that's going on in the house. Kids are at the age at that age, of adolescence. If you try to control them, they're only going to rebel. This is a biblical principle we see in Romans 7. The sinful nature cannot be tamed by the sinful nature itself. So our own human desires cannot be controlled by our own human interventions. It really takes the Spirit of God to help us mature. So
it seems like the thing that's remaining unspoken during this point of our interview here is the need to fail. Would you say that that's correct?
Well, what do you mean? Just like it's...
Well, when we talk about potty training, right? If we're constantly picking up the child and rushing him to the bathroom every time we see him grimace or show any signs that he needs to, relieve himself, or she, then obviously that's not allowing the child to figure it out to some extent, to have the negative feedback loop, which, if we're consistently not allowing the child to drive the car, or pulling back that ability to do it, or not providing that opportunity to, I guess that's a poor example, but what I'm trying to get at is through my codependent and addictive nature, what was required for me to learn some boundaries and to learn the ability to be well internally was to have a lot of negative feedback.
Yeah, so I mean, failure is on the road to success. Nobody is successful in life in any degree unless they've dealt with some type of failure. And so failure can be the seed that leads to the growth that we need in order to find success. And so failure is okay. It doesn't mean that you're a failure, just whatever you are currently working on isn't working, and maybe you need to change certain things. But, and the truth is, when we get feedback from other people, we don't necessarily like a lot of the things that are said to us. So we want to speak the truth in love to one another, but at the same time, we want to be honest. So we use the truth to help us grow. And it may feel negative to us, but it really is positive. So pain is okay in that context if it's helping us to grow. So, it's okay for kids to feel failure as it comes along. And you just encourage their ability to succeed and, just help them learn. That's why a lot of kids, a good teaching tool is just learning an instrument. Like, it takes a long time to be really good. When you compare yourself to like a professional artist on the radio, you feel kind of bad about it. But, just practice makes perfect. It's just the same thing for a lot of things in life. Like, it's okay for kids to not get an A all the time. It's very difficult to do that on a consistent basis. So you're making it not about just the performance, but about their growth as an individual and their ability to make choices on their own without you.
I'm just reminded of an article that we read, or I read. I don't know if you read it from Richard, but he was talking about improving as a skier, and he kind of expanded on the practice makes perfect adage, and he changed it. He said practice doesn't necessarily make perfect, practice makes permanent. And to have the wrong tools or to use our own, our best wisdom without any professional input isn't necessarily the best way to go about a particular situation. And in his example with the skiing analogy was that he was getting less than perfect advice from the beginning. It was better than what he was doing, but it wasn't the best that he could be. And then using the measuring stick of what's the best that I can be, and trying to find that through practice and really good instruction as well.
Mm-hmm. And that's a perfect segue for where I wanted to go for the last question. So, as you might imagine, running a podcast called the Sober on Purpose podcast and the Joyous Family about recovery, I get a lot of women emailing me asking for prayer and saying, I'm stuck. What do I do? I'm not the one who's using. I'm married to somebody who is, and I feel stuck in this situation. I know you don't have 5 top tips, but when is it appropriate to seek the professional help? What would you say to encourage them in their situation to come and see you, or come and see, anyone who could help them get unstuck?
Yeah. So, if you're in an abusive situation, you need to get out as soon as possible. And, even if you need to call the police, you need to do that. If there's physical or sexual abuse involved, definitely. So I want to get that out of the way for sure.
Sure.
But if it's more of like an emotional abuse situation that's going on, or, they're just addicted to whatever substance, the whole temptation will be to obsess over the other person and constantly worry about what they're doing, where they're at, what's going to happen. When in reality, you are actually, not that this is your intention, but you're actually feeding into and enabling the behavior by putting so much focus on the other person. And you guys know that. So the best thing that you can do is keep the focus on yourself. And that's where you implement self-care. That's where you get the support. So whether it's just going to a recovery group, getting some help, there has to be some emphasis on taking care of yourself. And so the first step is just shifting the focus away from the other person toward yourself. What are some areas that you need to work on? And then eventually, what are boundaries that need to be set? But getting support. And I think support groups are really good because as soon as you walk into that room, people already know 90% of your story because they're going through the same thing.
Right.
And so support groups can be very good at eliminating shame and helping people feel less alone. And when you get to the point where, as you get support in these groups, that you recognize that you're still struggling with self-esteem or in setting boundaries, when you've kind of hit another wall, maybe not as huge of a wall as before, but you've hit another hurdle that is beyond the scope of what the group can provide, that's where one-on-one counseling can come into place.
And that's something that we'd like to speak to too. We've been doing this. We've done support groups, but we did do a significant amount of one-on-one counseling. And one of the things that I also liked about your podcast is you do one-on-one counseling with people who are not right there in Arizona. Do you want to share a little bit about that? This whole new world of technology that's out there.
Sure. So, I'm the director and founder of Arizona Christian Counseling in Phoenix. And so most of our counselors are master's level certified pastoral counselors or state licensed counselors. And we do now offer online counseling through a telehealth platform, so we just do it over video, but it's through a secure HIPAA. I don't want to go into all that, but pretty much it is according to the law, it is private, so no one can hack into it. So we use a secure video system that's through our EHR, or electronic health record, to meet with people online. And we have certified pastoral counselors. Our state licensed counselors can only meet with people in Arizona, but our pastoral counselors can meet with anybody in the world. If you're not in Arizona, we do offer online counseling to people who are struggling with certain things like this. And I have, I definitely have 2 other counselors that specialize in codependency as well.
Fantastic. Well, and I think we live in a very small town, and so we've lived in several very small towns. So sometimes the counseling options are very limited. They may be people that we work with their spouses or their children, and that's just it's not comfortable or appropriate to do that. So I think the online visual opportunity is marvelous, and I just adore the podcast. So I really want you to keep doing the podcast. I know you are super, super busy, but it was something that I've gone back and I've listened to that one and a dysfunctional family one, a couple other ones about relationships. Give us the name of your podcast again and how they can get in touch with you. Truly, you haven't seen it yet. It truly has a magnificent website. It is really easy to follow, very easy to get to. And Jeanette is fabulous. She answers any question you need.
Thank you. Yes. Jeanette is my practice manager, for those of you wondering who that is. But yeah, she mans the phone every single day, well, weekdays, and she's always willing to answer any questions. The website for the podcast is just askachristiancounselor.net, and there's information there not just about online counseling, but we have a lot of free resources, blogs, podcast episodes on different topics. I also have a free personality assessment. It's totally free to take. And we also have a totally free course in biblical counseling. If you want to learn how to study the Bible and how to apply it in a more practical way, that's available for free as well. It's askachristiancounselor.net.
And then you have a course coming out in April, right?
Yes, we have a personality assessment. It's called the Christian DISC, DISC, and that's a very well-known form or personality assessment that divides people into kind of 4 different categories. The assessment is free to take. You can take it now, but we're going to be doing a certification program for people who want to be certified in order to teach and use the assessment in counseling or with groups. And that's coming soon. So.
The assessment is lots of fun. I should have had you take it. I'm an otter.
Oh, nice.
So I'm an otter, and I'll have him take it and figure it out. And
I was the lumberjack, I think.
Maybe that's where it's from.
Yeah, maybe. So it's really simple. It's online. You just fill in the blanks, and Tress gives you all the information about it. And I think I'm going to get a chance to sign up for the course, so I'm excited about that too. It gives you a little more insight into how you're thinking, which I think is really important as you're trying to drill down and figure out what the next steps are for you. So Trace, we really enjoyed having you on, and hopefully we can have you back. Thank you for suffering through our technical difficulties.
Oh, it's no problem.
And we will talk with you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening. We did something new this time. We actually recorded this interview on video, and we have 2 microphones. How's it having 2 microphones?
I hope you guys like the sound quality and notice a difference.
Yeah, and that we're not sitting on top of each other. That was a little bit of a problem.
I missed that part. It was kind of cuddly.
So anyway, we're going to put this out as a video, and Adamas was kind enough to let us do that with his work. He's also got some great stuff on his website and his podcast. I've been listening over and over to multiple different things on his podcast. But even better than that, if you are thinking about counseling or questioning whether you need counseling or not, that organization does a free call to kind of get you sorted out on whether counseling is for you. We talked about that a little bit in the podcast, and it may be a direction you need to go on your healing. In the vein of healing, we're also starting a coaching practice, and we're going to talk more about that in the coming weeks. But Jerry also has some exciting news.
I am starting a new line of work coming up April 12th. I am no longer with my current employer, and I'll be going out on our own personal family adventure, which sounds like I'm going to be doing it exclusively for a while until I can convince Tanya into joining the fray, as well as our boys.
That's right. So we've kind of let our Instagram and our Facebook page lag, but Jerry's off on adventures, so we're going to get him to post. I'm going to start posting again, and we're going to talk more. You can find us at thejoyousfamily.com, The Joyous Family Instagram, Twitter, and you want to talk about yours?
Oh gosh, it's been so long I can't even remember where it's at. It's Motocross Family, I think. Is that
yes.
what it is?
So look for us all over there, and we'll look forward to talking to you.